town hall meeting is usually called when there is an issue which affects an entire community and needs to be discussed. That issue is the continuing decline of our nation. Thanks for joining us, for this is our final town hall meeting as we discuss the matters under the headings of Pray, Vote, Stand. Here's Mike Bain.
Last month in our town hall meeting, I made the statement we should ask ourselves what sort of country we want to be. Hello and welcome. I'm Mike Bain from Christian Voice New Zealand. And thanks for joining us for our last town hall meeting before what is being called the most important election in our time. It's rather interesting they've called it that. The media have called it that. In fact, if you go back 3 years and 6 years and 9 years, you'll probably hear that they've called every election the same thing. But anyway, as we incorporate our themes of Pray, Vote, Stand, as we've looked at the state of this nation in previous meetings, today I want to look at 3 questions about New Zealand. What sort of country we were, what sort of country we've become, and what sort of country we ought to be. Hopefully by the end of this meeting we'll all agree with each other, and if we don't, well, I'm sure you'll ponder the thoughts expressed, and I welcome any thoughts, good or bad. I'm sure you'll leave them in the comments section. But what sort of country were we? It's always been fashionable to look at the past and the reason why many people look in the rear vision mirror, and that is to see how far they've become. What sort of country could we have been, is the question. Jacinda Ardern talked about being aspirational, and I think there's a great place to start. A new colony in the British Empire, it was looking to aspire into a nation built on things like Christian values and principles. The underlying foundational principles, well, they're a bit vague, obscure to say the least. But it's believed, though, by scholars that they would have included relevant statutes based on things like the 1297 Magna Carta, the 1688 Bill of Rights, the Act of Settlement from back in 1700, which would have regulated succession to the throne, among other matters. As well, of course, there was the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. But the underlying principle was one of democracy, where the monarch of the day, in this case it was Queen Victoria, today it's King Charles, where he or she is represented by the Governor-General, whose decisions are upheld by acting members of the Crown, such as the judiciary. But it was the place of Parliament where the power of the country was to sit, and where decisions would be made for the country and by a majority of consensus from parliamentarians would then be signed off by the monarch's representative, the Governor-General. Well, once established, other foundation principles could be adhered to, such as the rule of law, the principle of legality, the dignity of the individual and the presumption in favour of liberty, respect for property, natural justice, access to the courts, the spirit of principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And it was on these foundations New Zealand became a part of the British Empire. The Treaty of Waitangi was signed in good faith by the Queen's representative and many Maori tribal leaders at the time. To say New Zealand underwent some growing pains as settlers and Maori clashed over lands is a bit of an understatement, an issue which is slowly being settled. But what sort of country were we? Well, around the turn of the 20th century, all were living and working harmoniously towards building this nation. Hard times for the young country were not unlike other nations around the world, with the Great Depression as an example. For its part, as a member of the British Empire, it was called upon to supply its young to distant shores to be sacrificed in the name of the realm and freedom. Following the war, those who had survived the horrors of war, they returned home, and they were expected just to get on with it. They married their long-time sweethearts. They produced a boomer generation, and the country drifted along. Either no one knew the word aspirational or knew how to spell it, but it was a great time for those who remember it. Our neighbours in the Pacific, well, they came to live with us because this country was a safe place for everyone to live. All races, both brown, white or any other colour, lived in harmony. It was kind of like a utopia with differing nationalities working together. I can't say all was perfect, but in the main, everyone got along. This was the real foundation of New Zealand, and one which could have gone on and been aspirational to other lands such as the US with its civil rights issues, and South Africa and its apartheid regimes. But the rumblings of discontent were just starting to rumble within New Zealand's generations, starting to voice their discontent. It wasn't just a New Zealand thing, as we see many Indigenous peoples from all parts of the world starting to rise. The rumblings of change started with the sexual revolution of the 60s with its free love, drug culture and the Vietnam War. Those 4 decades prior to the turn of the 21st century seemed somewhat fast changing. Our young people started to find their own voice, and we started having conversations about free love, contraception, divorce, abortion and peace. They were all to the fore. In the latter part of the century, we saw the start of the technical revolution, and the voice of the younger get louder each day. Those voices were joined by a plethora of others, such as the gay rights, women's rights, and everyone else who thought that they had some sort of right as well. But the problem with all those voices was it just became a bit of a babble, so much so everybody appeared discontented. By the end of the 20th century, the Y2K bug was the least of our issues. New Zealand had changed, and so had its sense of morality, integrity and values. And this really does bring us up to about the turn of the 21st century and the birth of the country we'd become. We started to see people no longer accepting what had gone before. We started to have a culture of blame. It was like a cancer spreading across the land. Everyone started to exert their own rights, and yesterday's agreements started to look a little bit shonky amongst the growing generations, to the stage where discontent was found everywhere. Instead of a society built on Christian principles, one of which was love your neighbour as yourself, become one of where everyone started to love themselves and want what they thought was rightfully theirs. Well, everything was wrong in this country where brother began arguing about and exerting their rights against each other. It was where they chased God and common sense from the public square, out of Parliament, out of education, and dare I say it, off the marae and homes. Any aspirations our forefathers had that we would become a land where everyone was welcome, a land where we would live in peace with each other, was shattered. It's about here I want to touch on the Treaty of Waitangi. Like many, I'm not an expert on the subject, but in 1840, after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, it was recorded there was a loud hurrah and a declaration made, we're all one people, a sentiment that lasted well over a century. But in 1975, the Treaty of Waitangi Act was passed by Parliament and altered again and again just a decade later. Amendments were made to right the wrongs of the past, and so they should. I don't think anyone in this country would disagree that Maori may have been shafted at the time. But this appears to be not enough amongst some members of Maoridom, and the cracks in the cultural peace and harmony started to appear. Which brings us to our lowest point in history thus far. In 2017, democracy changed when New Zealand underwent its first political coup, where the majority party with the most votes were unable to continue to rule. We all remember Winston Peters wouldn't allow National to take the Treasury bench, and he allied himself to be the kingmaker and hitched his wagon to the Labour Party. The transition from a country which championed democracy was about to change, and we were to become a country which looked the same, felt the same, but there was a differing agenda in the air. We heard the word aspirational and fell in love with a Prime Minister who, as history has recorded, was clearly out of her depth as a leader. Instead of the aspirational goals of Jacinda Ardern, failure was starting to creep. Before the pandemic, there were signs despite all the promises. Housing, lifting people out of poverty and improving the lives of ordinary citizens could not, and still 6 years later, be delivered. Without a doubt, COVID changed many countries around the world, but here we saw things happen which we would have never accepted in any other time frame. New Zealand became a nation which looked totally different because of the emergency powers which were enacted under the guise to keep its citizens safe. As I mentioned, it's always good to look back to see how far we've come, and now hindsight tells us that we, the New Zealand public, were sucked in by the forces from offshore and we were ruled by fear. The COVID years will be remembered as a time when left-wing Marxism collided with straight-out fascism, with lockdowns, border security, restrictions on everyday life. We were encouraged to report on the actions of our friends, neighbours and family members. Society was separated into the haves and the have-nots over the mismanaged vaccine rollout. New Zealanders were signed up to become guinea pigs in a worldwide grasp for control. And it was during this time we heard the words, "Be kind, put a teddy in the window." Many put them at the gates and they just weren't kind because they left them out there in all sorts of weather. Just saying. Be kind. It was a kind of the mantra of the smiling Prime Minister, who was indeed a Marxist, but also a puppet with his strings being pulled by the World Economic Forum and the United Nations. My friends, if you told me back in 2017 we would have censorship across the country with army checkpoints, I would not have believed you. Life after COVID is no better, as the divisions in this country have become worse. From the declaration, we are one people, we definitely are not as one. Although Jacinda Ardern has gone away, her Marxist ideals are still held by the governing party. Smile all you like, Prime Minister Hipkins, but a return to power for your government and what it stands for will see civil war, if not greater civil unrest, as the divisions of the entitled come to the fore. This is the country we are today. A country bent on destroying everything previous generations wanted for us. We're a country with no aspiration because a country divided cannot stand. This is who we are. This is where we are. And all I can say is good luck to those fleeing from this land. I asked at last month's meeting, what sort of country do we want to be in the future? And today I've changed that and I asked, what sort of country should we ought to be? For us to be a great little country at the bottom of the world that we have, we must get along. We need to put the past behind us and live with a sense of decency towards each other. Bob McCroskey from Family First is going to love this one. We need to bring families back to the dinner table. Yes, we do. We need to take responsibility for our families. If you're going to let the village raise your child, beware. The village produces idiots as well. And believe me, there's plenty of them these days. We need to have a culture of dignity and acceptance of each other, as we're all different, and our families, tribes, we're all strangers to this land that we call home. You know, with the forthcoming election, we need to have strength, wisdom and fairness back in Parliament. Above all, we need leadership, not popularity. If it means we need to change our constitution, then let's start having the discussion. You know, there's so much we can do, but it takes someone to make a start if we're to heal our nation and become what it ought to be. Now, can you be that person? Can you accept your fellow worker as different, has a differing opinion, maybe even has different skin colour? It doesn't matter. We need to accept and let others know we accept them. So let me come to our theme of those meetings throughout the year. Pray, vote, stand. Without a doubt, if we as a nation return to God His love, His mercy and His sovereignty, we as a nation will be blessed. We need to pray for that to happen. It just won't suddenly become all kumbaya in the morning, but if we took a biblical attitude to the way we treat each other, you won't but help notice the difference. So yes, I ask you, pray for this nation to become what it ought to be. Other ways we can make changes is to ensure who we vote for has the country's best interest at heart. We, all of us, can send a message to our wannabe politicians that we reject the state and culture of this country and encourage them to work towards the goal of being the country we ought to be. Finally, on the word stand, I'm going to make an addendum here and say, stand firm. New Zealand, we have a great country, one with its natural beauty, its climate, its cities, but above all, its people. We need to stand together without entitlement and adopt the old mantra and return to being a great country with its number 8 fencing wire attitude. We need to continually pray for this nation, for each other and ourselves. We need to return to the democracy the way it was intended. One man, one vote. We need to guard against anything else which is going to creep into and change this great country of ours. We need to stand firm on the blessings that God has given us by way of life, family and home. We need to lift our voices as they did after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi and declare we are one people. That is the type of country we ought to be, and one that would be truly aspirational, would it not?